Good morning to you all. Let me begin by thanking everyone who has traveled from various parts of Germany and Europe to be here today, as well as everyone who is following us on the internet. I would also like to say a special word of thanks to all the activists and staff of Die LINKE, the party of European Left and Transform Europe, for their dedicated and committed efforts to make this conference possible. The growth of the far-right social and electoral influence summons our worst ghosts, making it hard not to draw parallels with the harshest episodes in the history of the 20th century. Memory takes care to remind us of the Shoah, the Porachmos, the persecution of left-wing militants, the banning of trade unions, the persecution of disabled people, the subordination of women, the exaltation of macho violence, the cult of violence, the repression of LGBT people, in short, racist brutality, destruction, war, ultranationalism. The growth of the far right also serves as an accelerator for the worst policies of European governments and Europe as a whole, such as the militarization of our borders, the securitization of our societies, the deregulation of labor laws and increased military spending. On the other hand, it seeks to prevent our societies from shaking off the weight of inequality and social division. They do so because they know that their strength lies in the resentment that inequality creates. They want to prevent at all costs countries with a vast colonial past, such as it is mine and so many others in the global north, from having an open debate that dispels the myth of the alleged civilizing benefits of the European imperialism in the global south. They want to prevent the ideological structures that support systemic racism in our societies from being shaken. With equal determination, they scream hysterically against all policies of equality that seek to overcome the chains of inequality of class, gender, or sexual orientation. In short, they want inequality as a state policy. Where there are unequals, there is supremacism, there is division, and above all, sectarianism, hate speech, exacerbation of collective fear. We all know the stupefying slogans of the threat of cultural Marxism, critical racial theory, gender ideology, or great replacement. But the pages of our most difficult moments also contains acts of overcoming that have marked us and defined who we are, as it is certainly the case with Dolores Ibarruri, whose phrase, non pasarán, we borrowed to organize this conference, as it is the case of every individual and collective story, anonymous or popularized, which with its resistance freed us from the long fascist winter, conquered social and citizen rights, but it also a history of the present. It is the story of all the people who do not conform to the politics of war and call for all efforts for peace, even when the calls for military escalation are heard everywhere. They are extraordinary people who organize themselves to rescue and welcome refugees, irrespective of their nationality or religious belief, knowing that their humanitarian acts could be condemned in European courts by unjust laws. It is the Polish women who do not accept that their reproductive rights are called into question. It is Italian workers who do not tolerate militia organizations invading the headquarters of their trade unions. It is the people of Chile who fight neoliberalism and Pinochet's fascist heritage. The young people who strike for the climate. The racialized people occupying streets to demand that Black Lives Matter. The women who fill squares in major cities on the 8th of March. As difficult as it may sometimes seem to us, the idea of solidarity, mutual aid, let's even call it socialism, has a lot more power than we think sometimes. And that is why we have come together here today to discuss how to fight the far right and how to build an alternative to it. And for this debate, we are counting on Janine Wissler, Co-Chairman of Die LINKE, Sira Rego, Member of the European Parliament from Izquierda, Unida, Cecília, Honório, Founder of the Portuguese Far-Right Observatory, Danièle Obono, member of the French National Assembly from France Insoumise, Dáire Hughes, Deputy General Secretary of Sinn Féin, to whom I thank for accepting our invitation to be here today. Thank you. Our first speaker is Janine Wissler, Co-Chairwoman of the LINKE. Janine, the floor is yours.
Liebe Freundinnen und Freunde,
Friends,
ich begrüße euch ganz herzlich und freue mich sehr, dass
would like to welcome you most warmly, and I'm really happy that today's conference, No Pasarán, allows me to open the discussions on the International Day Against Racism. The International Day devoted to the struggle against racism reminds us of the massacre of Sharpeville on the 21st of March 1960. 69 people were killed in protests. This is why it is good and correct to have this conference today, although one thing is clear. It's a day every day must be a day to fight racism, to fight everyday structural racism. This is the call of the day for all of us, all the time. Before saying something about the threat from the right and right-wing structures that we have here in Germany, Europe and the world over, let me say a few things about the issue that has concerned us the most in recent days. We all have seen the horrible picture from Ukrainian towns and cities, the pictures of destroyed residential buildings and hospitals, people fleeing the war in millions, the pictures of dead and wounded, people who sit in air raid shelters, who sit in basements fearing for their lives. This is why I would like to say very clearly today, this war of aggression unleashed by Russia against Ukraine is a crime and must be stopped immediately. Of course, we are in solidarity with the people in Ukraine fearing for their lives, and also with those courageous people who protest in Russia themselves, who demonstrate, who go out to stand up to Putin, despite police pressure and repression they have to fear. These are courageous people, and they are a sign of hope that Russians are opposed to that war as well. The distractions we've seen, the risk of war that has heightened shows one thing for sure. There must be no new arms race. There must be no new round of rearming the armed forces, as we've seen now in Germany. It shows how urgently necessary it is that we disarm, that nuclear weapons are removed, are banned. There's the need for a global peace order. This is what we need, and the answer must not be rearmament and nuclear deterrence, but diplomacy and disarmament, dear friends. Now, I think one of the key issues for us as the left in Europe is to show solidarity with the millions of people who have had to flee their country. It's good that EU countries have now declared to take in refugees, even those countries who refused to do so in the past. It's good to have special trains carrying people to safety. These people need help quite irrespective of whether they have a Ukrainian passport or not. The solidarity and the support must be granted to all people fleeing war and bombs. We do not forget that in the Polish-Belarusian border area, people have been camping for weeks and months, hidden in the forest, people who fled wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, people who have not been given support, people who were left to their own devices, and illegal pushbacks and fencing prevented them from entering the EU. We do not have two classes of war refugees. These people have the same right to flee, and they deserve our support and solidarity solidarity. This is also part of the struggle against racism. The threat from the right is growing. It's growing in Germany, and it's growing in Europe and in the world. Especially here in this country, right-wing terrorism has had a long history even after 1945. It's not a new phenomenon. Just think of the Oktoberfest assault of 1968, the racist attacks in Rostock, Mölln and Solingen. The series of killings unleashed by the NSU, 9 people were killed for racist reasons. And the family of the victims were not supported by the state, but were confronted with suspicions and discrimination. The killing of Walter Lübcke, Halle, the attack on the synagogue there, Hanau, where 9 young people were killed haphazardly and accidentally, simply because the murderer wanted to kill people with a migratory background. The bereaved families in Hanau are calling for investigations, and they have clearly said that Hanau must not be another station of right-wing terror. Hanau must be the last place. Since 1990, dozens of people, more than 200 people, were killed through right-wing terror, and many of those who survived did not get the necessary support. They were criminalized and subjected to suspicions. The right-wing terror makes one thing obvious. We must stop to play down right-wing structures. For far too long, Germany kept saying that these are just individual cases, isolated, confused, bemuddled perpetrators. No, we know that the right-wing scene, the Nazi scene, has built networks not just in Germany, but across Europe and the world in general. There are militant structures, where it's the Blood and Honor Network or others, that operate worldwide and cooperate worldwide. These structures, these networks must be taken seriously, and we mustn't belittle them and play their activities down. We have seen that very clearly here in Germany when we tried to demand clarity in the investigative committees. What we heard and saw there is not the determination to finally clear up all these incidents, but a full blockade. The intelligence services have played a dreadful series in the past and are probably playing it today. Rather than unveiling the whole truth, reports were declared off-limits, confidential for decades to come. Victims, eyewitnesses were not heard. If you want to fight the right wing, you need to take a determined stand. You have to take their arms away, and you need to unravel the structures behind them. Of course, the right wing scene is dangerous, but it's even more dangerous when the networks even reach far into public institutions within the Bundeswehr, within the armed forces, within the police forces, where police officers have access to sensitive information, to data, to weapons, and where people can get training to handle arms. These structures are especially dangerous. We have all that here. It needs to be investigated, it needs to be smashed. Racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Zionism must not find a place here in society, and this is why you have to cut the ground from under right-wing terror. This means that everyday racism must be fought. When we talk about the far right, we also need to talk about those who provide them with cues. Until recently, we had a domestic affairs minister here who said that migration is the mother of all problems. What do you do with that? We have a party in the German parliament that is the parliamentarian arm of right-wing terrorism, the AfD, and they provide slander against refugees. They put German history in relative terms. So we have to fight right-wing terror also by fighting the parliamentarian arm of right-wing terrorism and those who claim to be the middle ground. The topics of the new right is anti-Semitism, racism, hatred of Muslims, and the hatred of women. Wherever the right wing is strong, the women's rights are under threat. Right to reproductive rights, right to abortion. Pro-lifers hate women. They blockade clinics and advisory centers. So this covers also transgender people, the LGBTQ community, and this needs to be fought relentlessly. So let us listen to people who tell us about their experience with everyday racism in society, about structural racism they experience every day, when they tell us how difficult it is to have a name that doesn't sound German, to get an apartment, to get a flat, when people have to tell their children that they have to make greater efforts to be better at school because of their migratory background. This is humiliating, and being caught in police checks, racial profiling, being searched in front of neighbors or strangers, although you haven't done anything, and how difficult it is occasionally to find employment, to deal with the authorities when you're confronted with racism, structural discrimination, and ignorance every day. If you want to fight the extreme right, the far right, we have to fight structural, everyday racism in this society, not just on the International Day Against Racism. To do it, we need to mobilize. We need to mobilize on a broad basis. The best protection of the Constitution in any country is the people that fight racism every day, who oppose Nazis, be the anti-fascist groups, Black Lives Matter, Grannies Against the Right, people who oppose the right wing every day, who support refugees, who call for their rights. These are the people with whom we need to build networks. I think the left international is needed as a loud voice protesting all forms of racism. For us, solidarity is indivisible. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine, for your strong words. Now, Sira. Yes, thank you very much. If you agree, I stay here. I'll be closer to you. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today, to be in this place. It is a very important space and room in these times of the upcoming far right. It's very important to exchange, to have counter-proposals, to know what's going on the ground, and that together we will develop strategies and also concrete practical approaches in order to obtain the same objective of equality. I think if we want to analyze these times, it is very important to have a look at the concrete practical reality, especially as what we live as Izquierda, Unida, the United Left. And that is also the starting point of my analysis. My analysis that starts from a social criticisms. We cannot understand without understanding what's going on an economical, sociological, political level. For example, climate change and the problems that it brings with us. The eco-social crisis, I just highlight that very shortly, is very strongly linked to the capitalistic model of exploitation and the societal aspects that go with it. Of course, linked to climate change, to the crisis of biodiversity and the breakdown of our living space that comes from the activist action. It's this not only an ecological but also a social crisis. We as Spanish intellectuals refer to that. It is talked about an increase, but it's rather something that we need to get out of it, and this is directly linked to the increase of the far rise of fascism. In our times, our mind is very strongly linked to the fact that we do not find any issue for the ecological and sociological crisis, that we don't find a solution for climate change. Just one moment, please. Can I just take a break, please? Thank you. Excuse me. If you agree, we can switch over to the next speaker. Yeah, we can give you 5 minutes, no problem.
Hello. Hello, Cecília. Welcome. Cecília is from the Portuguese Far Right Observatory. So, Cecília, the floor is yours.
Est-ce que vous m'écoutez?
Oui.
Un problème? Oui. Bonjour, je vous salue.
Good morning. Hello. I talk for the Observatory for the Extreme Right. It's a network of activists. We have published in Observatory work of 2021. We are organizing the conference on feminism and how to combat the far right. This took place after the election of party of Sira, maybe you know who it is, after the parliamentary elections in 2019. Up to then, we thought we were immune against far right. Why? I'd like to talk to you about the new far right in Portugal, not only fascism, and why we need our organizations. Well, in the liberal Western democracies, since the 1990s, there was a very strong development of the far right movements. In order to understand that, you need to know the different cases in the different countries, but also in link to the global developments. Let's get closer to the reality in Portugal, but also the developments in Spain. The long fascist past has created a taboo in both countries. The far right is a survivor of the rationalization of liberal democracies in our peninsulas and were pushed to the margin. In Portugal, right-wing groups were marginals. They committed crimes, and only the far left talked about them. After 40 years, the far right survived. PSD and PSDS was integrated into legal parties. In Portugal, we think we also have to preserve the memory of the colonization of African countries, and it's directly linked to the development of the new far rights. So there are several factors linked to the new far right and the crisis of the traditional right, for example, the memory of the Troika, Pasquale on the right, and the progressive extinctions of the CDS. And there are external factors, like Trumpism of politics. Second, there's also anti-system positioning, people who went out of the traditional right and set up new far-right parties, tie-wearing people, Pascal de Pipe and others. It was just like a tradition authorized by a system, and there's also the complicities of social communication that had a decisive impact on the development of the new right, Ventura in Portugal. It's that says it doesn't matter how you talk, but you have to talk about us. One example, in December 2021, the mentioning of the two candidates that were put on the second places, Ventura obtained almost 3 times more references to the extreme far-right candidate in 2 dailies took up these figures. Another example, according to McDissels, Ventura was the second most quoted person in television, and at the 3rd place after Antonio Costa in January 2022 for the parliamentary elections. So they talk about them televisions, and after the elections, there was also some mimetism in reference to Spain. In 2019, after the success of Vox in 2018, there was a lot of media impact of Vox in Portugal. At the same time, you have to consider the political context and historical context of both countries, the difficulties of political communications, the disruption of populist talk that vitalizes the rationality of politics, and it was not sufficiently understood by the left, and didn't really take it seriously. As for the Portuguese case, far right gained 12% in the parliamentary elections, and together with PSD, or the Solch, etc., but far more than their ambitions, they haven't overcome the 6% limit in the parliamentary elections. They have a lot of internal scandals, and the basis is not really solid. On the other hand, in Portugal, what's lacking is a collective agenda for the new right in Europe. We don't have enough immigration. There's not enough insecurity, even if there's strong perception or idea of corruption. And I can tell you the right in Portugal wants to rewrite history, but that's not enough in order to have really a far right as it exists already in Spain, in Vox. Those are my answers. I think we have to fight against the normalization of the far right. We have to try to understand what is new, what is old, denounce. We've done that in Portugal. The programs of machism, liberalistas, the links to the elite with obscure financing, the collaborative work with the social communications. We need more actions in order to change the public opinions. We need solidarity and international actions. And that is why this initiative is so important. Thank you so much.
Words. Now, Sira, let's.
Disculpad, he tenido una pequeña bajada de azúcar, supongo, y me he despistado. Agradezco este ratito de.
Well, I obviously struggled against the drop of my blood sugar, so I'm sorry for that. So let me try to finish my contribution and be as accurate as possible. I already mentioned the rise of the far right in the context of the various crises, the eco-social crisis we have at the moment. So the collapse of the world climate will put us in a situation where the current paradigm with regard to society, politics, and the economy needs to be rethought. We need alternatives. We are in a political and social crisis. And the models of public services, care, and everything else is in a profound crisis. Of course, feminist approaches try to find an answer. So we live at a time when a transformation is urgently required in order to cushion the effects of the capitalist model. We have exploited the earth over decades, exploited the resources, and had a lifestyle that exploited nature, and we simply cannot go on like that. What we see at the moment is that there are mutations within the capitalist system. The far right, just as it was widespread in society in 1939, 1940, it tries to do that again. At the time, the crises were very fundamental. We also have very fundamental crises right now, and the far right tries to save the system that we have. The extreme right, the far right, want to save the existing system and change it in its own spirit. At the moment, we have societies in Europe built on a consensus that goes back to the Second World War. And they focus on the central issue of human rights. What we see now is that the far right questions one of the foundations of the human rights. What we see very often in our day-to-day activities in the European Parliament is that the far right, just as I indicated earlier, tries to cast in doubt the consensus we have. When degrowth is no longer a debate, but a fact, the discussion needs to be held whether the reduction of growth can be shaped in such a way that it is just. The far right doesn't want to support that. This is why it is important for us as United Left to have forums to discuss another model, to present other solutions. We need to be careful. The far right wants to redefine the framework, saying that human rights are under threat now because there's this dramatic cultural war on. This is an agenda of the far right that is based on the clash of civilizations, on the fight against freedom. That's their only agenda. This is where they draw their resources. The clash of civilizations aims to build a new consensus as to who is in and who is out. It goes without saying that the majority of the people are out. Women, migrants, LGBTIQ people, young people, those who organize against classes. So the majority of the people living in societies now wouldn't have a place in their society. And whenever human rights are concerned, freedom within society, they want to demolish it. We have to expose that. We have to tell people what it means. We have to offer a solution to the socio-economic crisis. Who is in, who is out is an important issue for us to clearly define. We need to be aware of the dimension of the ecological crisis. As the United Left, we need an alternative that we can present to people and show them that the majority would be in the new society. And we need to present a legal system that is based on solidarity and inclusion. So we have a number of rather weighty tasks to solve. And in this context, we need more discussion. I'm certain that we have the context of fraternity, sisterhood, freedom, unity. There's no dissent on that, but we need an up-to-date analysis what it means for us when the far right gets stronger. I read a book recently. I don't know whether it's translated, but it's a very interesting text written by Stephen Fortier, a professor at the University in Barcelona. He's an expert in analyzing the far right, and he has characterized them really well. This is the kind of reading we need. And it's important for us in the left to be able to analyze the situation better, to understand what goes on and to see in what way the far right gets active. Second, I believe another important task of the left is the following. We should develop a horizon of hope and implement it, achieve it. We must think about how this place of which we dream can be translated into reality, in our daily reality, in our daily lives, as a countermodel to the far right that is talking about security and protection, but what exactly do they mean? We have seen how the far right gets actively involved in current events. It's not just about the political parties of the far right that present themselves as parties. We also see that certain values, certain horizons of the far right have become part of the agenda of the neoliberal and conservative right wing. So these horizons need to be exposed. We need to present our own solutions, our own horizons, and this is another important task of the present time, a transformational agenda for Europe and the whole world. And third, which I think is also very important, is something that the anti-fascist colleagues of today and the past will recognize. In the 1940s, we managed to mobilize the working class. This is impossible to do now with the same way of doing it. Appeals, declarations, and that's a kind of struggle. No, we need to approach the majority of the people in society, and feminism has a part to play here. It's one element of the struggle against fascism, a very important element. Feminism shouldn't necessarily be seen as an anti-fascist element, but rather as an anti-capitalist element that can achieve the kind of world we dream of. as an element that provides protection and security from another perspective. Silvia Federici, a great feminist, said when many women achieve something on a very small scale, it's an attack against the patriarchal model and the model of the far right. Because protection and security have to do with guarantees for prosperity, guarantees for a worthy living, the rule of law in the future. This is also part of the anti-fascist thought. We also have to close ranks with the ecological movement. We need to fight against the ecological exploitation, the ecocide, the movement that fights for the rule of law, a social welfare state, and the rights for everyone. Eventually, we also need to look at local policies, things that affect everyday lives. So where the big alternative horizon needs to be implemented on the lowest level in the communities as well. All that is able to write a narrative, to develop a narrative for the left in order to present to people an alternative that can be translated into reality. It is indispensable for us to create something new and to make progress. And here, the anti-fascist movements of today and the future need to be broadened. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for my little breakdown at the beginning.
Muchas gracias, Sira, por la enérgica intervención. Y ahora habla Danièle Obono, member of the French National Assembly from France Insoumise. Thank you, Danièle, for being here.
Vielen Dank. Thank you very much. And now, Daniela.
Is it okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me today. In this very strange moment that we are all living now, a very dark time, I think it's so important for us to be able to meet, to discuss, and to fight back against fascism and against the rising dark forces that are threatening to crush our project of another world. I am Danièle Obono, and I want to share with you the experience of trying to build an anti-fascist movement in France from where I stand, which is as a member of the parliament, but also as an activist, an anti-war activist, an anti-racist activist, and also in a very special time right now in France, because we are 1 month away from a very crucial election, the presidential election, which decides pretty much everything in France. And we've been living for 5 years under a right-wing government, which presented itself as neither right nor left, which means it was right-wing government. But what is very interesting regarding our conversation today is that Emmanuel Macron was elected 5 years ago to stop the far right. That's the very reason why people actually voted for him, not because they believed. Most of the people who voted for him didn't know his program and didn't really adhere to it, but because Marine Le Pen was at the second round of the presidential election 5 years ago, and there's this Republicanist and anti-fascist push to oppose the far right, and he was elected thanks to Marine Le Pen. Now, fast forward 5 years later, there's not just one far-right candidate, but two far-right candidates, and their votes and the poll shows that they amount to 35% of the electorate and of the votes right now with the estimation. And so what happened? What happened so that it's just not one but two, and two including one candidate, Eric Zemmour, which is an actual fascist. Like Marine Le Pen was obviously the far right, and the Le Pen little family company that has been growing over the past 30 years in France is well known now. But what was very interesting is that they transitioned from, actual fascists, very proud of being fascists, to some kind of trying to normalize themselves and make themselves mainstream. That was the task of Marine Le Pen, actually, over the past 10 years when she took over from her father. So she was helped by the mainstream media and the mainstream political forces to make her respectable. And that's also what put her at odds with some of her electorate and some forces within her party, which means that today, Eric Zemmour, which is the other far-right candidate, is supported by most of his supporters are from Marine Le Pen's party. So you have this division between the far right, but that doesn't weaken them, actually. That gave them even wider space, media space, to spew their rhetorics, their racist and xenophobic rhetorics. And Eric Zemmour has been pretty vocal and has been given a lot of space to do that. I want to just, maybe you don't know about it, but this is a man who has been convicted of hate speech by, three times now. And he is, a presidential candidate, and it's okay because he was given free media time. He had a TV show in one of the now, which is a far right channel, Sinn News. We usually compare it to Fox News in the US, but it is very important to understand how Eric Zemmour came to be. It was by the will of Vincent Bolloré, who is the chairman of the Sinn News, who is one of the wealthiest men in France. So it is very a candidacy from the ruling class. Part of the ruling class is now pushing a fascist candidate because they think this is the one who will be able to maintain their hegemony and to make sure that there's no unrest, social unrest, political unrest that could derail their rule, actually, in French society. But it's not just the reason why we are in this situation, very dreadful situation in France, is not just due to the ruling class and people like Vincent Bolloré, no matter how wealthy they are and how far right they are. I think what has been happening in France is the intensification and more intense class war that has been happening. Over the past 5 years, we've witnessed one of the biggest social movements in French history. That is the Yellow Vest movement and the anti-pension reform movement. And those movements, I think they are very telling about how people reacted to rising inequalities in France, to lack of public services, and to the attacks on what is one of the bases and what we inherited from decades and actually centuries of working class struggle, which is social protection and pensions. And especially when you think about the Yellow Vest movement that started out to oppose rising in fuel from people that you usually wouldn't see in demonstration. And most people who testified were part of the movement and said that they had never been into demonstration. And they came from the countryside. They came from very remote areas, from rural in the periphery of cities. There were pensioners, there were people unemployed, there were liberal profession. And you would have expected that the way those people were portrayed, have been portrayed in the media for decades now, is that they are like right-wing or far-right, and this is supposed to be the preferred electorate that will vote for the far-right. But what got them together is not chasing after migrants, was not demonstrating against Islam or anything. It's actually a very social and even more social, it's a matter of social justice and climate justice also, because rising fuel price meant that the government was trying to implement it using, the need to adapt to climate change and something as a green measure. But people opposing, saying that we're not against green policy, but the problem is that it will impact us most. We're already lacking everything, and now we have to be burdened by that. So I think it was a very progressive movement, and I think that's important. I wanted to focus on that because of what I said earlier. It seems like French society is now totally on the right and the far right, but that's not the case. People have been opposing rising inequalities, opposing the lack of public service, especially for those people in the Yellow Vest movement, when they say that they depend on their cars to actually be able to go to work. There's less and less train service and train station, and they actually wanted more of that. So this is the society that has not turned to the far right. The one who turned to the far right is the actual ruling class, and especially the ruling class in governments, which is the Macron regime. Because the way this right-wing government reacted to very legitimate demands from the people was by unleashing one of the harshest repression in our history, which is a history full of social movement, full of state violence, but this was unheard of. After 5 years of Macron, some journalists counted what happened there, and it's like there've been, over the 5 years of demonstration, more than 3,000 people were hurt, more than 300 were critically harmed by the police force. 30 people lost an eye, and 6 people lost an arm. And this was unheard of, the level of police violence, the level of judiciary violence also that was unleashed on the people. And I think it says a lot about the Macron regime and the way it actually reacted to social movements. That is a very right-wing, and not just right-wing, but very reactionary way to react it. And especially it shows what people may not have understand at the beginning of the Macron regime, but what we in the parliament witnessed very early, which is because three of the first bill that were discussed at the National Assembly were first the anti-labor law bill that was crushing our labor law and protection for workers. Then it was an anti-terrorist bill that put the emergency state against terrorist attacks into common law, which is a terrible regression of civil liberties and stuff. And the third one was the anti-migrant law. So from the very start in 2017 and 2018, those were the priorities for Macron: crushing labor law, crushing civil liberties, and targeting migrants. And especially when you think about the migrant, I mean, this is one of the theme that is used by the far right a lot. During the discussion at the National Assembly, usually it's not even the far right who was the most stigmatizing migrants. But what the far right said, Marine Le Pen, but also I remember Matteo Salvini, the Italian far right leader at the time, actually congratulated the French government for implementing part of his program with this law. So what I meant to tell you about this recollection of what has been happening in France, especially the way the Macron government showed himself to be a much more authoritarian and much more reactionary. I could talk about also how his minister launched a wind hunt against academics because of some Islamo-leftism, what they call Islamo-leftism, but it's all part of the anti-woke cultural war that the right is launching against the left. But that's what fueled the far-right discourse, and what made it okay for the media to invite all the pundits and all the far-right spokesperson for the past 5 years. And I think it says a lot about how the entire political landscape moved to the right, to the far right, and they actually agreed with part of the solution the far right had been advocating for years, but was relegated to the fringe, but is now mainstream, like regarding social movements, like regarding trade unions, or regarding migrants, or regarding young people from immigrant background, and the way, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement was treated in France, and what Emmanuel Macron said about it, actually demonizing those young people and denying for a long time police brutality in France. So what I mean by that is showing how what we have to fight, it's just not the far right, but all the policies that are implementing by the so-called Republican right that are fueling the far right discourse and make it mainstream. I think one of our biggest tasks now is to make the far right, to push them back to the fringes of the political landscape, and to push them back to what used to be their very tiny spaces in our political lives. And to me, back to present France and the fight that is ahead of us, which is an electoral fight, but not just an electoral fight, because what we've been focusing with Jean-Luc Mélenchon candidacy is how we mobilize the very people who abstain from politics and who have been abstaining from politics, electoral politics, for the past 5 years, but who at the same time have been onto the street inside with the Yellow Vest movement or supporting the anti-pension reform movement, or who have been joining young people because there have been demonstrations against police brutality in France, despite the government trying to prevent them from happening. And of course, there's the climate change movement with a lot of young people. But the discrepancy between those social movements and people actually getting involved into electoral politics is, to me, what we have to fight in order to close this gap. Because if we make credible political platform that people actually believe in, that is possible, actually, not just to resist the neoliberal onslaught on our social rights, but also to expand our horizon of rights, of what we can do, especially when you think about climate change, which is the biggest challenge of our generation, of our world right now. We have also to make our political program something hopeful, something people, especially at the time when there's so much fear, actually. And I think one of the thing that the far right actually feel is fear. And the idea that you are all alone, especially at the time with the COVID crisis and now war, we have to be able to put hope back into the agenda and to propose platform that people will actually want to fight for and think that it is actually possible, not just to resist, but to change the world. I think that's what that is what our task is as a left. And we have to stand tall at a time when everything makes us try to cower and to accept what is happening. To me, what is very inspiring is that despite all that, despite the past 5 years and the rise of the far right, those movements never died, and the spirit of resistance never died, whether in France and everywhere else, especially when you see, for instance, what is happening in Russia right now, people fighting against the war and anti-war activists defying very difficult, I mean, it's an authoritarian regime there, and they actually face serious prison charge, but they still fight back. And to me, it's the inspiration, obviously with the resistance from Ukrainian people also, that we have to learn from and to be able to be on the offensive now and not just defend and be on the defensive. There's literally a world to win back in the next weeks and months, and not just in France, but I think all over Europe and all over the world. And I hope that our conversation today helps us understand how we fight back and win this new world.
Thank you a lot, Danièle. Now our next speaker is Dáire Hughes from Sinn Féin, Ireland. The floor is yours.
Jadív Akarja, fraternal greetings from Sinn Féin to all our comrades in the European left, to our host, to LINKE, to Transform Europe. Thank you all for the organising of this timely and important conference. The title of this event, No Pasarán, invokes an emotive response from Irish Republicans, as it should progressives and anti-fascists the world over. Our party is particularly proud of the response of the volunteers of the Irish Republican Army made in response to cries for help from the fledgling Spanish Republic in the 1930s. But whilst we celebrate and remember those brave volunteers, it is a lesser known and deeply dissatisfying fact that the numbers of Irish men who volunteered to fight for Franco far outnumbered those who fought against him. Whilst over 350 Irish people fought for the Republic, 7,000 volunteered to destroy it, with around 700 serving in Franco's army. The Irish political and religious establishment encouraged huge numbers to join the fascist crusade, led by a reprobate called Eoin O'Duffy. A popular Irish folk song puts it well: propaganda from the pulpit and newspapers helped O'Duffy to enlist his crew. The bishops blessed the blue shirts as they sailed beneath the swastika to Spain. The looming spectre of the far right, of fascism, of populism and conservatism stalks Europe to this day. It could reasonably be considered that the threat from the far right manifests itself in two rudimentary ways. The first, in electoral terms, where far-right parties and candidates represent a genuine electoral threat and have or are on the cusp of gaining influence. The second, less obvious but equally insidious, where the far right, through a variety of mechanisms, are able to inform or direct the political establishment in adopting their policy. In respect of the first, I feel somewhat ill-equipped to speak with any authority on the issue. The far right, in a traditional sense, do not represent an electoral threat in Ireland, certainly not to the same extent as elsewhere. Whilst governing parties in the south of Ireland have their roots in quasi-fascism, and governing parties in the north have previously championed sectarian discrimination, it would be incorrect of me to conclude that Ireland has an immediate threat or an immediate problem with far-right political gain. We do have a ragtag of disparate parties, poorly led, with incoherent policies registering minimal impact. We have no Le Pen or Zemmour, we have no Farage or AFD, no Trump or Golden Dawn, no Vox or Wilders. At the last general election in the south of Ireland, all far-right parties combined registered less than 1% of the vote and returned 0 representatives. Neither, Akarja, can we draw on the emotion of history. We have had no Franco, no Salazar, no Hitler, no Mussolini. And I am deeply conscious of these considerable differences when sharing a platform with comrades and activists in movements today combating far more pressing threats from the far right. In respect of the second manifestation, however, in the ability of the far right to pull public discourse and eventually policy closer to their position, then we in Ireland have to keep our guard up. It is a sad reality that on occasion, on certain issues, the far right in Ireland do possess significant presence to influence the powerful. It is to some degree a legacy of our colonial past. 100 years ago, Britain withdrew from its seat of power in Dublin Castle. An Irish Free State was formed, followed by a bloody civil war and institutionalised counter-revolution, undermining totally the heroic work of the 1916 Easter Rising. This chaos was midwife to the new southern state, a deeply conservative, misogynistic and sectarian state which placed the Catholic Church in an unrivalled position of power and influence. Those British forces that withdrew from Dublin Castle didn't sail home, by the way. They simply marched to the north of Ireland and became the vanguard of a new northern state following the partition of our island. There, an even more entrenched sectarian state was formed with a Protestant supremacy. Discrimination against the Catholic population and the Irish identity was the order of the day. Housing, employment, education, and even the electoral franchise was discriminated and sectarianised in a regime that openly embraced tropes of apartheid. If the history of the far right in Europe in the 20th century is indeed the history of Christian and Catholic nationalism, then in that regard, Ireland was a pioneer. The Irish state has been administered by a right or centre-right government without break for over a century. Whilst not fascist, certain policies pursued by consecutive administrations divided communities, entrenched inequality, and facilitated discrimination. Political censorship was on the statute until 1994. Blasphemy was only removed from our constitution in 2018. Women were particularly affected by the conservative ethos of this state. Divorce was only legalised in 1995, and reproductive rights were only secured after decades of struggle and campaigning in 2018. Across the island of Ireland, racism rears its ugly head in respect of the Irish traveller population. For decades, official Irish government policy was to criminalise the nomadic way of life, and as a result, to this day, anti-traveller sentiment remains high. By any metric used to measure disadvantage, travellers fare badly. These issues, that racism, brings home for an Irish audience something that could be reasonably considered to be universal in our combined struggle against the far right. And that is the following, that neoliberal discriminatory policies of government can create space for the right wing to flourish, and that the basic foundations of far-right politics lies in the presenting of simple, jingoistic and oft divisive solutions to complex and deep-seated issues. One thing we have to accept and address is the success and apparent ease with which the far-right populists and even fascists can communicate an effective political message. It's not effective in terms of its content or its ability to deliver solutions, but it can be effective in mobilising opinion. The Brexit campaign remains a key example of this. Britain had its fair share of issues in 2016, but the ability of the Leave campaign to tie the issues of the day to the EU must stand as a lesson to us all. Measured voices, both in favour of EU membership and opposed to it, failed to disarm the bombastic communications of the British right and far right. Correspondingly, the failure or the unwillingness of political establishments to deal with the crises facing ordinary workers and families can create fertile ground for the far right. Austerity policies that strangle public services result in working communities turning against one another as hard-working people struggling to get by fear anything that could affect their ability to make ends meet. Welfare claimants being stigmatised while multinational corporations avoid billions in tax. The ceding of ground in the immigration debate by Christian Democrats, as well as by some Social Democrats, emboldens the far right. A generational housing crisis is raging in Ireland. All but the highest earners are locked out of the housing market and rents are soaring out of control. No investment in community development and a reduction in the number of community police officers has seen gangland crime grip the streets of our towns and cities. A culture of shortcuts, privatisation and underinvestment has crippled our health service. These issues all cause genuine disillusion with the political process. They should be ripe issues for the far right to mobilise on, but in Ireland, at this juncture, they are not. That is largely because we, progressive Republicans and our allies, fill that space. Just as light does with darkness, the only way to beat a bad idea is with a better one. Sinn Féin have been effective in communicating progressive, left, credible solutions to these crises. We, with others, have deprived the far right of the oxygen it needs. And this is no boast, comrades. We still need to keep our guard up, and there are other fronts which could be more fruitful for the far right. Sinn Féin's firm commitment to the principles of equality and fairness, combined with credible, actionable proposals to address issues, has been effective. The creation, promotion and delivery of credible, effective policy is the best long-term solution to counter the threat of the far right. Policy based on standing up for workers and families, addressing real and immediate need, communicated in direct and unambiguous language. Grassroots campaigns and legislative action on workers' rights, on community safety, on housing, calling out corruption in government, defending the rights of people moving to our countries, socio-economic rights, and ensuring that the cost of the environmental crisis isn't heaped on the poorest in society is crucial. Every kitchen, every sports club, every community group and every staff canteen is a site of struggle. Crucial too, in starving the far right of what it needs, is the promotion of a vision for a better future. In our case, the vision of a reunited Ireland in which the full potential of our people can be unleashed. There remain huge challenges, though, particularly in respect of the networks established by anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination movements in recent years and months. Far-right groups were able to mobilise and put thousands of people onto the streets of our capital in protest at moderate public health restrictions. We're not naive. Those networks haven't receded with the virus. As a result of Russia's heinous aggression against Ukraine, 2 additional threats have emerged to varying degrees. The first, new calls to militarise Ireland, participation in EU military initiatives, abandoning our neutrality, and even whispers of joining NATO. The second, emerging commentary calling to question our capacity to accommodate refugees fleeing conflict. We must, like all progressives, hold the line in defence of neutrality, non-alignment and humanitarian intervention. Conflict can only be resolved with dialogue. Likewise, we must focus our attention on addressing the concerns of those people fearing the impact of large refugee numbers. The state must adequately resource public services in order to humanely accommodate refugees and not exacerbate existing social crises. In summation, Akarja, our shared struggle, our fight against the far right is relentless. Even in nations where the electoral footprint of the far right is minimal, they represent a serious threat. We must be vigilant, directed by our collective objective of delivering a better, fairer society, but tactically agile enough to respond to threats as they emerge. This, I believe, constitutes part of the uniform approach the broad left must hold to. We know that we can't rely on the forces of the political establishment in this struggle. We know that the best defence is a good offence. And we know that just as in the fields of Catalonia in the 1930s, that solidarity and internationalism is key in fighting the forces of fascism and the far right. Gar míle maith agah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dáire, for your inspiring speech. So we have now a short period for questions, which must be brief and may not last more than 1 or 2 minutes. Otherwise, Pierre will shoot me, and I think nobody in the room wants that. So I ask everybody who wants to ask a question to raise their hand or to make a brief comment. We can start here.
Hello, I'm Seema from Another Europe is Possible, based in the UK. Quick question. All of you here are from your different national parties, national left parties, but we're here as the European left trying to organise internationally. What can we do to change the rhetoric of our nationalist, national-based parties so that we can imagine structures and organizing that are genuinely transnational and which genuinely unite the working class across borders. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody want to make another question or a short comment, a brief commentary? If not, I will read the questions we received by Zoom. So, the first question for Danièle. Do you think Mélenchon will make it to the second round? And then we have two more comments I'm going to read briefly. International right wing is very good, connected, especially anti-feminist, anti-abortion networks are working international. That is one question. Commentary. The other commentary is, don't forget the Roma people, one of the main target group by the far right and the state institutions. And then the last, greetings from Colombia. Here the left-wing alliance Pacto Histórico won the election last Sunday, tripled its votes, and it's now the strongest political force in country. We are very happy to hear that, of course. So if there aren't any more questions, we will go now to the final round, and we'll start with Dáire, if it is okay for you. Dáire, we will start. You can also, of course, comment what each of one has said, and ask you to not speak more than 5 minutes, if possible. Thank you again, Dáire.
I've spoken enough. I'll be very brief. Just in respect of the first question in relation to the internationalization of our struggle, I think forums like this are vitally important in terms of sharing experiences, and what works in some countries may not work in another, and we have to accept that. However, there should always be nuggets of gold that we can take from each other's respective struggles and apply them to our own. Our experience has been that the most effective way of communicating a political message to people is by addressing the issues that affect them most daily in their locality, something that's real and tangible and affects them. And to that extent, internationalism probably isn't the correct forum for that. But where we do draw great source of succor and pride is in the inspiration that other movements can provide to us. So when we hear about victories for the Colombian left, when we hear about advances for the left across the continent, or when we see other organizations and parties doing well, it always helps to reinforce our message. So in terms of internationalism, it is the motive, it's the big picture stuff, it's the vision for the future. It's collaboration, broad front, big mobilization, trying to make as broad a movement as possible for the advancements of causes of which we all hold dear.
Thank you, Dáire. Now, Danièle, back to you.
I'm going to try to be brief about Mélenchon's candidacy. Hopefully, we'll get to the second round. That's the goal, actually. And it's attainable, actually. It's not something we just dream of, because now Jean-Luc Mélenchon candidacy is polling third, right behind Le Pen and then Macron, and it really is now the left alternative to the right and the far right, and that's what we're going to build on in the next weeks. And to mobilize, as I said, our focus is on the people, millions of people who have been abstaining from taking part in the elections for the past years, but are very angry for very legitimate reason against Macron, and are not yet attracted by the far right. So we're here, we've been campaigning for over a year now, and in the next weeks, crucial campaign events to mobilize for that. So hopefully, and I hope we'll get as many support also internationally as possible, because I really do think that we can actually change the conversation in France. Just imagining in between rounds, presidential debate between Macron and Mélenchon, which would not focus on Islam or migrants or police, but on actual social issues. And I think it could really, even if we don't win the second round, it could really change a lot of things in the country. And I wanted to react to what Sima asked. I think there are maybe 2 or 3 important international movements that we have to strengthen. The first one is the anti-war movement. I think it's crucial, not just to support the Ukrainian people and to support people in Russia, but also for ourselves, because many people said that there's an escalation in military spending at a time when the humanity is facing climate change, and we should pool all our resources in order to face climate change and to transform our society to be able to resist that. But they decide, and it's a very, to me, it's a civilizational choice we are making, whether we're going to focus on war and without doubting that Vladimir Putin's nationalistic and aggressive invasion is something to be condemned and opposed. But the way we do it will decide of the fate of our societies. So I think the anti-war movement also, because this war is already and will have more and more effects on people home, whether you think about a rising prices, and it's already happening, and how do we resolve it? And I think that's where we, the left, have to find common and not just nationally, but I think the problem we are facing are the same. People will ask, working class people will be asked to pay for the war efforts, supposedly in solidarity with the Ukrainian people, but not, but the ones who are benefiting for this war are the same people who have been benefiting from the COVID-19 crisis. When you think about how much rich people and billionaires got even richer during the COVID pandemic, more than over the past decades. They got more money from the COVID pandemic. So it's the same thing with the war. The war profiteers are the same ones who have been profiting from the pandemic. So I think there's a link between anti-war movement and the social movement and the social demands. We could all push and have an international platform about what is needed from the people. Stop the war, stop neoliberal policies, and let's distribute wealth more equally. And I think those are the bases for international campaigns that we could build around. And the second point, quickly, is the climate change movement, because also I think it has been mobilizing worldwide millions of people who are aware, and even working class people, because usually the media are trying to oppose, working class issues with climate issues and saying like working class people are not interested in those things, but they are the ones who are the most victim of climate change. And I think we have we have to be able to articulate climate change and climate justice. For me, the experience of the Yellow movement shows it. It's possible to do that. So those are, to me, the two international platforms that we should strengthen in the next weeks and months. And there's a lot of, I think we shouldn't underestimate how eager people are for hearing voices that actually echo what they're like thinking deep inside, but because the entire media is just, spewing propaganda, neoliberal propaganda, they feel like they by themselves. But I think deep down, a lot of people are very eager to hear our, alternative voices. And we should be the alternative voices rather than the far right, because that's what the far right is positing to be, the alternative force to the system. We are the real anti-systemic forces for a new world, and I think there's a lot to be done together.
Thank you, Danièle. Cecília, are you there? Back to you.
Bon, merci bien par la possibilité de partager avec vous des idées.
Thank you.
Et je vous laisse quelques
Thank you
notes
for letting
finales.
me speak here and participating in the exchange of ideas. What
Les questions
can I say in conclusion?
Je crois qu'à la gauche,
When
on a besoin, encore
listen to the comments and questions, I think we definitely need a global agenda against the far right, which is not easy, no doubt about it, but we need to try it. Why? Because in every individual country, the far right has a presence, and it also has very often strong leaders. We have that in Portugal. A little Trump, a little Salazar mixed up, and you regularly see that they play around with the emotions of people. We do need a global agenda, but that global agenda needs to reflect the national specifics. This means we need to draw up realistic demands. The far right is not an accidental product, and it's no accident that it has become so strong. It has something to do with redressing the historical balance. There's a lot of complicity between the interests it has and the interests of the elites. So what we need is governments that are ready to compromise, which includes us as well. There's a program that helps to build democracy. Naturally, there are also conservative and ultra-national counter-programs. We simply need to be stronger. So there are huge challenges to face up to, and our weapons are the strengthening of the rights of the workers, the strengthening of the social welfare state, and the entire left-wing agenda. So the left is called upon to fight. We need an international agenda based on solidarity, and we also need to look at geopolitics. The war will have an impact on that as well. People will be in fear. Critical situations, crises are always a fertile ground for the far right to recruit new followers. So the extreme center is very much led by the United States, as the right-wing claims. We must find ways and means to make sure that the political center does not cooperate with the far right. We will have national elections in 2022, and we need a political center that is willing to lean toward the socialists, which makes sure that the far right has no chance to be represented in parliament, in government, and we need a strong left-wing alternative. Things are going to be interesting in France. The left has a chance to be successful in the presidential campaign. So far, my thoughts about it.
Sí, gracias. Estos días me parece interesante la reflexión y la pregunta que ha hecho la compañera. Estos días estamos viendo como al calor de
I quite liked the exchange and also the questions asked. We saw the past few days what impact the war has, including also on European societies. What we see is that the far right takes up its positions, takes a stand, and closes its ranks. We need to think about common activities, not only to provide humanitarian assistance, but also to change the relationship of power. What we see in Spain at the moment is a lot of mobilization started by the far right, and they try to capitalize on the rising prices for fuel, food, and everything else. And we, as the left, need to respond to that, to show people what the cause of the problem is. There's one thing that supports the far right is to invent imaginary enemies so that they can distract attention away from the real causes. So the far right invents such imaginary enemies in order to set a new framework. One element that may be simple, but it could be quite revolutionary, is that We need to defend the rights of everyone. This is a very important pillar, as I see it, if we want to make sure that the territorial context can be considered. Defending economic rights, ecological rights, human rights, societal rights, all that needs to be translated into a national context so that we can have an impact on people's everyday lives. Because the agenda differs, of course, according to time and place, but there are the huge international movements that enable us to join hands and perhaps to develop alternative horizons. My colleague spoke about that at length, and I would like to add the feminist movement. We saw in Spain that the feminist movement made it possible for us to achieve progress when we put forward an agenda that did not only speak of the strength of the rights for women, but when we also offered an alternative business model. The feminist movement in Spain argues for the construction of an alternative world from the bottom up in all terms. And this is what we need. We need complete and complex alternatives, and we need to show people how it can work. We have to say, no, we are not moving toward an abyss. No, we are moving toward equal and fair distribution. In conclusion, I would like to suggest that we need to think more about the issue of ownership. This, again, is everyday life. We live in a world where the resources are more and more depleted. There are more and more people living in the world, and we are confronted with the neoliberal agenda that joins hands with the far right in order to determine the economy. So ownership is a focal point, must be one for us. An energy oligopoly does not help us because it only robs the working people of their money. So distributing property and assets must be discussed. The energy resources must be nationalized, must be put back into the hands of the general public, and we need to make sure that the working class benefits from the resources. This is something we need to think about. The far right contributes to the political agenda its own ideas to make sure that the new consensus just helps the rich. And this is just the maintenance of the existing system, and it cannot be the solution in a world where the resources are depleted. Our agenda, our horizon must deal with that key element. I think it's complex, but we have to do something and adjust our narratives. It's necessary for us.
Muchas gracias, Sira. Y ahora, para la última intervención, yo doy la palabra a Janine.
Erstmal sehr gefreut über die Nachricht, die uns aus Kolumbien erreicht hat.
Much, and I was especially delighted to hear the news from Colombia. So I would like to congratulate the Colombian comrades to their great electoral success, because it is a sign of hope for all of us. And it is something historical achieved there. We have a panel on Latin America later on. So Chile is another place where the legacy of Pinochet is still very much alive. The elections in Honduras, Brazil, Bolsonaro eventually should be voted out of office. Now Colombia is a great success, so it's an interesting and fascinating development we are seeing there in Latin America. Well, we talked about the issue as to how we can oppose the far right by putting forward another agenda: anti-Semitism, racism, the protests against the COVID restrictions. Or I do not want to say that everyone going there and demonstrating is part of the far right, but the radical far right has tried to influence new layers than the pro-lifers, the anti-abortionists, and the denial of climate change. All that comes together. And I would like to follow up from what you said. We live in times of critical phenomena. We live in times where the various crises come to a head. We have to do with a crisis of distribution everywhere in the world. And in the pandemic, this crisis has sharpened. Ownership issues have aggravated, not only here in Europe, but also internationally, when we look at the distribution of vaccines, for example, or the vaccination quota in Africa. So we have to deal with a distribution crisis. We have to do with an ecological crisis, a climate crisis. And here we have to think of the people in the global south who are the first who are hit. So the capitalist core countries have the responsibility to reduce the emissions, but the climate crisis is aggravating, and we can see the effects of climate change everywhere. It's real, it's already there, and we have to do all we can to fight the ecological crisis. We have a crisis of peace, not just since the 24th of February this year. Peace has been in a critical state much earlier. Just look at the wars in Yemen, in Syria, in many other countries around the world. This is why we need to be aware of the increasing militarization of societies. We have authoritarian regimes posing a threat from the right, and all these critical phenomena require strong left-wing responses. The risk is for the left to fight the right, and then we are sometimes tempted to defend what is there, to defend what is there. But we need to show that we have answers of how to cope with the crisis, and I fully support your demands that ownership, who owns what and why, and how can we overcome these unjust ownership relations. The crisis we have cannot be fought with the kind of means that have created these crises in the first place. Human rights and social rights are indivisible. We need to connect the various struggles in order to push ahead with the socio-ecological modernization of societies, to oppose all forms of discrimination and racism. What we need is hope based on the principles of the left. Everywhere in Europe, everywhere in the world, the vision of a fundamentally different democratic society based on solidarity. This is our vision, and we must make sure that we have to build stronger networks in Europe and the world at large. And we need to learn from one another and inspire one another. So thank you very much for your interesting opening panel and your interesting contribution.
Vielen Dank, Janine. So I need to make some announcements first. The lunch will be until 1:30, and it will be picked outside. We are planning an action photo for all participants because of the International Day Against Racism. It will take place during the lunch break directly after this session. I want to thank once again everyone that attended to the meeting, to Janine, to Dáire, to Danièle, to Sira, and to Cecília for their brilliant, inspiring speeches, and to ask sorry for the people